Thank you, Alan. You'll see from the title slide here, we've got a question mark over the COVID virus. And one of the questions we had last year was the COVID virus a factor in our fatality rates in 2020? And we made a determination at that time that it was, and particularly in the 2-year-olds. And as you may recall, when we talked last year that in New York alone, the fatality rate in 2-year-olds for that year was 25% of our total fatalities. And in 2021, it's down to 12%, which is more like normal of what it's been over the past few years. So it looks very much like that was a temporary risk factor. And I'm pleased to see that the EID data was released yesterday. And in that report by Dr. Park, and he pointed out that COVID factor was a factor not just in New York, but across the nation. So I think we are happy to see that put behind us. And let's take a look at 2021. Andy, could I have the next slide, please? So the big picture from 2012 to 2021 is a continued decrease in the number of total fatalities. And this is all causes. This is not just racing, but racing, training, and non-exercise related fatalities are continuing to decrease, since 2012. You can see the dip that happened in 2020, but it's interesting that there was obviously a big decrease in number of starts, but ironically, there was a slight increase in the number of fatalities in certain age groups, particularly the 2-year-olds. So nonetheless, I think the big picture here is one that we can all take to heart, that we're continuing to decrease the number of fatalities in the Mid-Atlantic region throughout this whole period. Next slide, please, Andy. Now, this was a little bit interesting. We look at these fatalities when we sort them by activities. This is just a comparison between 2020 and 2021. And what we can see is that the most significant change, there was a fairly significant increase in racing fatalities in the past year. Training fatalities were down just a little bit. That may not be significant. And the other fatalities, these are non-exercise related fatalities, were down a little bit as well. But when we see an increase in racing fatalities per 1,000 starts, that's an area that we need to pick our heads up and say, well, we need to take a look at that and figure out what's going on. Next slide, please, Andy. So when we look at the Mid-Atlantic starts, you've seen this slide before, that the number of starts in our region has definitely decreased. And so given the number of starts going down, one might expect the number of fatalities to go down to some degree about that. But let's take a look at the next slide, Andy. So while we had a 22% decrease in the number of starts, we had a 40% decrease in the number of fatalities. What that means is that the decrease in fatalities is due to factors other than the decreased number of starts alone. So these are risk factor modulations or interventions that have been put in place over the years that have helped to reduce these fatalities above and beyond the number of decrease simply because we're racing fewer starts. Next slide, Andy. This is a comparison that we've done for many years now between the Mid-Atlantic fatality rate and the national EID fatality rate from 2010 to 2021. And I think you can see that there was a pretty good gap initially between the Mid-Atlantic rate, which is in blue, and the national fatality rate, which is in orange. And then by the time you get down to 2016, it's pretty consistently the same, slightly above. Last year it was below the national rate. This year it's slightly above the national rate. But my point is that I think that, again, this shows that the work that we've done in the Mid-Atlantic group has really helped to improve our fatality rates, or decrease our fatality rates, actually, but to do better than we have been in the past by continued focus on these issues and things that we can do to make it better. Next slide, please, Andy. So in summarizing then, our general fatality rate is a 39% drop since 2014. The total number of fatalities did go up a little bit in 2021. And this is, I just want to mention this is never a time when we point fingers at anybody. I think, though, that there was an awful lot of publicity about the Laurel Racetrack surface issues that came about this year. There was a big number in Maryland. Maryland's fatality numbers would have been significantly less if there wouldn't have been some kind of a incident down there where there was challenges with getting the racetrack surface, tuned up properly. And I know Glenn Kozak went down there and was instrumental in getting that squared away. But I just want to point out that when we monitor things like this and we have our strategic plan to reduce fatalities, it doesn't mean that there won't be spikes or that there won't be moments when we're going to have an issue that we need to address. But what it does mean is that when those things happen, we have systems in place to address those problems and try to make sure they don't happen again. That's a really important take-home message about this fatality risk management program. We did see an increase in racing fatalities a bit there, and we need to look at that and figure out what else might. It wasn't all about Laurel Racetrack, so we need to take a deep look, a deep dive on that, see what that was. But these are areas that deserve scrutiny. Next slide, please, Andy. So we do know now that COVID-19 was a risk factor in 2020, and it was nationwide, not just New York. And the problem was that horses lost training time, and then due to a number of complex issues that involved economics and population epidemiologic factors with the pandemic, that these horses just didn't get the appropriate training earlier in their careers, and they never had a chance to catch up. And when they were put into racing competitions, by mid-July at Saratoga, at least, and certainly in other jurisdictions as well, that there was an increased fatality rate because of that. We've known about this issue of training 2-year-olds for many years now, but it just is one more natural fact. It was a freak of nature here that happened. It was not anything anyone intended, but it certainly validates our assumptions and our belief that these young horses need a certain amount of high-speed furlongs under their belt before they get to the races, and there has to be sufficient time between those high-speed furlong events to allow for the proper modeling of bone to take place. You can't just put it all in together in a short period of time and expect it to work. We did have a notation here that we're slightly above the national fatality rate. I haven't run a statistical comparison on it yet, but it was pretty small. It was 1.39 was the national rate, and 1.53 was the mid-Atlantic rate, but they're close, but I still don't, we use that as a metric. I just don't like to see us get above that national rate. So we need to work on that. And then I want to point out also something interesting in 20 and 21. I don't have data for all the jurisdictions. I do have data for both New York and Maryland. And the number of cardiac related, if you will, or presumed cardiac related sudden deaths decreased dramatically in these two jurisdictions in the past year. This corresponded with a change in the regulation of the use of thyroxine at our racetracks. It has been basically declared a prohibited substance. It can be used if a therapeutic use exemption is granted. Now, what that means is that if a trainer or a veterinarian has a horse that they can prove to the commission that they really are hypothyroid, they're by all means, the horses can be treated. But the criteria for granting that therapeutic use exemption is no longer a simple T3 or T4 level. And the reason for that is that a couple of years ago, I started looking at this with our horse population in New York and looking at the reports from Cornell University that any horse that had a T3 or a T4 less than 1 was considered hypothyroid, quote unquote. And so these horses were theoretically then qualified for a therapeutic use exemption. At the time, it wasn't a therapeutic use exemption, but that was the diagnostic criteria for treating these horses with thyroid hormone. Well, working with Tom Divers, we did an informal study. We looked at a lot of horses and just took as many normal horses as we could get and sent the tests up to Cornell. And almost all of these horses were below 1. And so the point is that the normal of 1.0 in thyroid testing for T3 and T4 is not reasonably used in a thoroughbred racehorse. Why? Because there are two things that we know for a fact will decrease the thyroid levels in a racehorse. One of them is exercise. And of course, they get a lot of exercise. And the other is the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And they get a lot of that too. You can see the number of our positive findings. It's the most common positive finding we have is the NSAIDs. And so these two factors in play, we had to rethink what the appropriate use of thyroxine might be. So now we use the thyroid stimulating hormone or response test, if you will, where the veterinarian is required to take a blood sample as a baseline, then administer a stimulating hormone, TSH, to stimulate the thyroid gland. If that test comes back that the second number is way lower than the first number, then the horse truly is hypothyroid and does qualify. But I can tell you in the last 2 years, since this rule was put in place in New York, I've had 5 applications for therapeutic use exemptions, and I did not approve any of them because none of them showed a decrease in the thyroid levels in the blood after the second test was taken. So this is a really important important change, and I know it's only 1 year, but let's have the next slide, Andy. What I did was I looked at the average number of sudden deaths diagnosed as a cardiac issue, a potential cardiac issue. And that's typically a negative diagnosis, and only about 30% of horses do we actually find something in the heart that is meaningful to collaborate the idea that it really was a cardiac issue. But we get backed into that diagnosis in the absence of anything else for the most part. And because the presumption is it's an electrical event that doesn't leave any traces behind. But anyway, 8.2 was the number from 2010 to 2020. And in New York in 2021, we had 3. Now we're monitoring this. That's only 1 year, and that's not that helpful, but it's certainly encouraging, and it's got my attention. So I think that it's very important that people in all jurisdictions take a really hard look at thyroid use in the racetracks. And I'm quite convinced it's been abused for quite a long time. Next slide, please.
God, if I could just editorialize on that just for 1 second. That's a textbook example of how our collective work in the region does have an impact when we can identify a problem. I mean, since the New York Task Force report was issued in 2012, we've been laser focused in this region on trying to identify risk factors and those things that might contribute to a equine fatality. And we've been very successful in identifying potential risk factors and trying to address them in a way that will benefit all of us. We saw with a large number of sudden cardiac events that something was amiss. And we believed, although there was some resistance outside the region to our conclusions, that the use of thyroid supplementation was a direct cause. And we had enough information from just barn searches and the work of investigators and otherwise to know that thyroid supplementation was very common in the barn areas at our racetracks. So we issued an advisory. We actually prohibited. It became a national prohibition. And the results speak for themselves. We know we were on the right track. So, we don't make up recommendations when we come to these meetings. They're scientifically and evidence-based. And, if we've missed the mark, we'll tell you that. But if we think we're spot on, as we do here, this is an example of how our work and our work in the region collectively can have an impact on our industry nationally.
Okay, I want to just move on to something a little different now. We're not going to talk so much about what's happened in the past, but I think there's some tools that we can use to do better in the future in terms of monitoring our fatality rates. Now, we know that the use of total numbers of fatalities it's a body count, and that's the favorite number of the critics of horse racing. And it's a favorite number because, first of all, it is a number that people relate to because it is a body count. They don't like body counts, and they're familiar with, all the issues with the Vietnam War and everything thereafter. We're very sensitive to this kind of thing. And so that total number, while emotional and very, used by a lot of people for certain agenda-driven programs, I think that it makes more sense and it's more honest for us in the industry to be looking at incident rates and putting things in perspective. And for example, for a long time now, since the EID was started, we've been looking at racing fatalities, and we don't just publish total numbers. We do in New York, they're on our website, but we also calculate the incidence rate by looking at the number of fatalities per 1,000 starts. It's a baseline. It's a standardization of the data so that it takes into account changes in the number of starts. It's a denominator. Okay, you basically take the racing fatalities, divide by the number of starts, and you get a number that basically corrects for inaccuracies that could be related to changes in the number of starts. Now, the EID does not do that for training fatalities, and there's some reasons for that, but I found it helpful in New York to look at training fatalities and for a denominator using the number of official timed workouts. Now, there's always some challenges or limitations of whatever metric you're using. And some might argue that, well, some fatalities occur when the horses are not actually doing official time workouts. They're galloping out there and they're getting a humeral fracture. I mean, these stress fractures are the principal ones. But I would admit that that does occasionally happen. I would also submit to you, though, that in the EID, the racing fatality rate is calculated on racing fatalities that occur within 72 hours of a race. And I can assure you that there are a lot of fatalities that are related to racing injuries that happen farther out than that, but are not counted. So I'm just saying it's not, these things are never perfect, but I think they do have a standardized value that can be used from year to year and time to time to make comparisons. The other fatalities, these are the non-exercise related fatalities. And the way these things are standardized, this is not news. This is something that's done in people where they look at fatalities in a human population. Basically what they do here is you take the number of horses that are at the racetrack for a given year or period of time, and then you figure out how many days they're there, and you can calculate things called a horse day, and that's a metric. So the horse days relate to the population density of the racetrack. So if a racetrack has a lot of horses on it, they're going to have a higher number of horse days. If they have a longer meet, they're going to have a higher number of horse days, and vice versa. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is an overall annual mortality rate that is something that caught my attention this year that I think is just interesting to talk about. Next slide, please, Andy. So I just wanted to show you, I don't have the data to calculate incidence rates for all these fatalities in the Mid-Atlantic region, except for the racing fatalities, which we've been doing for many years. So, but I do have the data to do this for New York. And I am indebted to the Jockey Club, and this is something that this data is available, as is true in all of these things that we're doing to get good metrics, to monitor our risk management programs. I mean, it's very important to have data, and we can get data from the Jockey Club. This data is readily available to the tracks, but it's not easy to get. It's just not in one easy place to find it. So one of the things we need to do, and I'm confident this will happen with HESA, is that this data will be readily available to people to do these calculations. Now, why is this interesting, or why should we bother with this? Well, one of the things is I've gotten a lot of questions over the years about how come our training fatality rate in New York is so much higher than our racing fatality rate? And the fact is they're looking at raw numbers. And it's just the fact of the matter is, for example, look at 2021 in New York. We had 27 racing fatalities. We had 36 training fatalities. Now, does that mean to a layman who's just looking at raw numbers, they're going to say, well, wow, this training is more dangerous than racing. But in actual fact, that's not true, because we had 19,590 starts in New York, and we had 52,551 official time workouts. And so when you look at these numbers, the fatality rate in New York this year was 1.38. The training fatality rate was 0.69. That's half as much. Okay, so this gives us, and that's fairly consistent. If you look, across these from 2017 to 21, it's pretty consistent. So I think we can reasonably say that training fatality rates are only about half of what the racing fatality rates are. They're not more. It's half as much. And why is it half as much? Well, first of all, they don't go as fast. A race horse is going at about 12 meters per furlong. A training horse breezing generally goes around 13 seconds per furlong. So they're going a little bit slower, and they don't go as far. Our races are never shorter than 5.5 furlongs. They're generally between 6 and 8 furlongs for the most part. But the point is that when people train, they generally train 3 furlongs or 4 furlongs, sometimes 5, sometimes 6, but rarely. So they don't go as far, they don't go as fast. It's reasonable then to assume that the fatality rate would be less. And in fact, it is. Without this kind of data, you can't say that with certainty, but we can. And now let's look at our other fatality rates. 25 horses died in New York last year related to non-exercise events in the barn area. How many horses, in terms of horse days, that's 71,708 horse days in Finger Lakes and NYRA racetracks. That's a fatality rate of 0.35, half the training fatality rate. So ironically, it's pretty consistent from year to year. And so what you can see is, in broad terms, we can say with confidence that the fatality rate in racehorses is what it is. That's our baseline. Training rate's about half of that, and the non-exercise related is about half of that. So the point is that this is an accurate way to really monitor these fatality incidence rates and enable us to target interventions specifically to address those particular numbers. Next slide, please, Andy. Now, this is an interesting one. How many times have you heard people who are attacking the horse racing industry say horses are just dying so quickly. They're dying. It's a killing field in these racetracks. They're dying like crazy. We got to stop the killing, right? And I often thought, and I'm not justifying that. All of you that know me know that I'm totally dedicated to saving horses' lives and improving mortality rates. It's the only thing I've done for the last 8 years. And I can tell you that I'm totally committed to that. But one of the things that people have to realize is that horses die. Horses die in the stall, they die on the racetrack, they die in the field. But the question really is, do they die more at the racetrack? And if they do, how much more? What are we talking about here? Do horses at the racetrack die 3 times as much as horses that are out in the field somewhere in the countryside? I mean, do they? I didn't know. And I'd challenge any of you to say the same. But what I came up with, I did find a way that I looked at some data that was done by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And here, the next slide, please, Andy. And what they did was they have something called an overall annual mortality rate, and it's a survey. So the data is not as good as our racing data because we've got really good data at the racetracks. But in this survey, what the USDA did was they surveyed horse owners all over the country, and they asked them things like, how many horses do you have on your farm? How many horses died this year? And they used information like that to calculate what they called an overall annual mortality rate. And what they do is they took the total number of fatalities and divided it by the total number of horses that were in the farm or wherever. And so interestingly, what I did was I did this for New York, and I looked at the number of horses that were actually stabled at the racetrack. Now, granted, you can have ship-ins coming in and out once in a while, but again, we're looking for basically a baseline data here that gives some reference point to us. But I took the total number of fatalities for all causes. That means racing, training, or non-exercise related. I divided it by the number of horses, and that gives you the overall mortality rate. And as you can see, it varied from 2% to 1.5%. The average, the mean for this 5-year period was 1.7%. Next slide, please, Andy. Now, interestingly, this fatality rate, this overall annual mortality rate for all equids, that means horses, donkeys, mules, right, living on farms in the United States, that's 28 states, was 1.4% in the study that was performed in 2015. They don't do it every year. They did one other one in 1989, and the fatality rate in that year was 1.5. So let's just say in New York, we're averaging 1.7. So the difference in the annual mortality rate at our racetracks in New York is 0.3% greater than that of every donkey, mule, and horse living on a farm in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that's good, better, and different, but I am telling you that this gives us a reference point to look at. And I think that it's a reasonable thing to think that we ought to be, look at this on an annual basis and see if we can compare the USDA numbers. And what it does, it says, yeah, okay, we are, 0.2% higher. And you know what? We have a very good success rate. When you look at the Mid-Atlantic total number of fatalities in 2021, if you calculate that out and turn it from the number of starts into a percentage, what that means is that 99.85% of every start in the Mid-Atlantic region in 2021 was completed without a fatality, 99.85%. What that means is that we're spending, really across the country, we're spending millions of dollars and spending enormous amounts of research efforts on eliminating the last 0.15%. And one might say, well, it's worth it, and it is worth it, and we all believe that. But I want to tell you that I challenge almost any industry in any kind of statistical analysis. If they are 99.85% successful in what they do, I think that's a substantial number to think about and to consider when people are telling us that we're operating killing fields at the racetrack. So I would offer that as something to be thinking about as we go forward.